Right, hello, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be having a look at one more thing in the landscape series, and that's going to be breaking up tiling in landscape materials. Now, we're using landscapes as an example for this. Landscapes, obviously you get quite big expanses of the same material, but all of these techniques can also be used on anything else. And I'm going to be using projected textures for this. I tend to prefer using projections for landscape because you can blend things together, have bits of meshing using the same projections, but obviously any of these things apply. So here we're creating projected UVs. If we just replace that with a normal UV node, and then obviously you'd have to change the division values. 256 obviously is working with world space. Here, if this were just using text chord, we'd change this to like 1 or 2 or much smaller values, but we're just going to be using projections for today. So this is my starting material. Just a simple grass. I've got a diffuse texture. I've got a normal map that I've artificially just sort of bumped up slightly. So I'm lerping between 0, 0, 1, which is the flat normal. Lerping that up to 2, just to sort of overly bump it up to make it a bit crisper so you can see on the video. And then I've just got a flat roughness of 1 everywhere for grass. So that's my texture, or my material, and it's applied to this landscape. Now this is obviously about the worst case we can have for tiling. Tiling materials are really good. Tiling textures, they're a really efficient and powerful way to fill a large area, but they obviously have their drawbacks in that you can see the tiles. So this texture here, I'll just open it up. Doesn't have a huge amount of detail in it. It's from the starter content, I believe. So there's no obvious hotspots, but our eyes are really good at picking up patterns and tiles and repetition. So these kind of darker patches of different leaves are going to come through in our landscape. And there's not really anything we can do about that. It's always going to be sort of visible, at least on the texture level. If you have a texture with very little detail, then it's not very interesting close up. So it's always a balance between kind of how you're seeing these things. But we can do some tricks in the material to do some sort of breaking up of this tiling, and that's what we're going to do. So the first thing, I've got all these pre-compiled. Hopefully shouldn't cause any problems with the recording, but I'll just open them up and break through them. So the first thing we've done, if I just swap back and view those, we're just going to add some noise to the base colour. So the first thing, open this one up, same setup, and the thing I've added here is this noise. So still using world space projected UVs, and I've divided by a different value. So our base texture's at sort of a tiling of 256, and this is at a lower tiling. And when we jump back to the viewport, we should be able to see that if I just change this value. So just looking, it's a bit subtle. We're trying to be subtle. We're not trying to make huge changes to our material here. We're just trying to sort of break up that repetition. But as long as we're using a different value, if I change this to be 256, exactly the same. Now the noise texture, and this is just a channel pack noise. We're only using the red channel, so just some simple clouds noise from Photoshop. Now the noise texture is tiling exactly the same as the texture underneath. So we've done nothing to break up that tiling, because we're using, if anything, we've made it worse, because now we've got two textures that are both tiling at the same rate. But if I change this and just sort of change that value, you can see now the tiling noise is helping to break up the tiling of the texture underneath. It's still there, it's still visible, but our eye is being kind of confused by the fact that the tiling noise is helping to sort of break up the tiling in the sort of the base color itself. And it's quite a subtle effect. So I've just taken that noise value, obviously it's black and white values, and I've just lerped it between 0.9 and 1.05, so can't really see in the preview, but anything that was black is now 0.9, so it's still slightly darker, and anything that was white is 1.05, so it's slightly lighter. And then I've just got a parameter here that I can turn it on and off for sort of preview's sake, and hopefully that's coming through in the video. It's subtle. If I really bump it up, multiplied by 5, you can see obviously that's creating quite a severe change to our material. Don't want to do that. We want to keep everything subtle, which makes it a little bit harder to demo. But just a little bit of noise in the base colour projected, and the key here is it's projecting at a different scale. So effectively all we're going to do is project a lot of things at different scales, and as long as those scales are different, they're going to help break up the tiling as opposed to making it worse. So one thing about numbers, I like quite nice round numbers, but in this case it's probably better not to do that. So here we've got 256. If I do 512, well, that's a multiple, isn't it? It's twice 256. So now, rather than having a tiling every square, actually every 4 tiles of the original is tiling again. So what you want to do is try and keep the numbers out of scale with each other. So if we think about prime numbers are numbers that can't be divided by anything except themselves and 1. Here, if we think of 256 as 1 times our number, if we did 3 times 256, or maybe 5 times 256, that tiling is only going to happen over itself. So if we had 2 and 4, you'd see that they would be tiling every repeats, because 2 divides by 4. But if we do 1, then 3, then 5, then 7, then 11, we're going to get tiling less and less often. I hope that makes sense. But basically, at the end of the day, they're just numbers. We just change them to what we want to make them look right. So here I can just scrub it, and because it's a parameter and this is a compiled material, we can see that update in real time. So just going to find something that kind of works like this. And it's a good idea to keep checking your material from different angles and different distances as well. Make sure that it's working for different things. Obviously the top down view, that's going to be the worst. We're seeing the most tiling we can, but here from sort of first person playable view, depending on your game camera obviously, you're getting a slightly different result. So to save shortcuts, little quick thing, you can do camera bookmarks. So you can set them by pressing Control on the value, and then if you press that value again, that keyboard, you jump between them. So I can go over here, Control 3, and now I've got another angle that I can really quickly jump to. So little tip, I use them all the time. They're really useful. So that's the first step, adding some base colour. That's fine, it works, gives us a slightly better kind of breakup of the noise, a little bit of diffuse colour change. But we can also do this in things like the normal map. So say exact same setup, just use the same noise texture, different tiling. So here it was 768, here it's 3000, and all I'm doing is having the same noise texture projected in world space, and I'm doing a flatten with it. So same logic as I did to bump up the normals here. I'm lerping between flat blue and my input normal, and I'm using that noise to create that variation. So maybe a little bit hard to see on the video. The noise can be a little bit more subtle, but if we just overplay that, you can see here there's a big patch here where there's no normal information, even with this normal completely overblown and quite crunchy. And again, that's just going to create that little bit of subtle variation. 0, 1. Probably not coming through in the video at all, but you can hopefully see the effect if I overblow it massively. And it's the same thing, having tiling at a different scale. If I can change the tiling, will that be visible in the video? Maybe just about. Difficult to tell with the compression, but you're changing the tiling here to be some value that's again different. So imagine you've got one square that's tiling this small square, next one's a bit bigger, next one's bigger again. When you combine them all together, then the amount of repeats, or the point where they repeat, is going to be like huge variation or huge kind of value based compared to the original one. Obviously we are still getting tiling, and we'll keep working on this to sort of add more and more layers, but if we just compare that back to the original, all this sort of front and center here, there's a lot more visual variation. And as I said, this is obviously our worst case. By the time you've sculpted, painted some other layers, added some props and set dressing, you're going to be breaking up a lot of those visual repetitions sort of naturally. Now, what's quite nice about the two things we've done so far is we could also animate them. So here, exact same material setup. What I've done is chucked a quick panner in, between the sort of the projection UVs and our texture, and because it's sort of affecting the normal map and the diffuse, you get this sort of effect of either being light coming through clouds. That's going to be creating that kind of multiply darkening effect, but obviously the sun and the clouds will move, so we can kind of approximate it. And it doesn't want to be super fast. We're not creating kind of like super scrolling textures here. And same, grass has this natural movement, doesn't it? Like the wind blows, there's a little bit of rustling, the grass moves. One way we can approximate that is by having our normal map noise generator scrolling slightly, and that will just give you a little bit of an approximation to what the wind's doing. And again, super subtle, quite hard to show off in the video, but gives you that sort of variation. Let's overblow these, there we are. Suddenly it's got really cloudy, suddenly our normals have got a little bit crunchy, and again they're moving at slightly different speeds, so the tiling that's been broken up is also adjusting all the time, and because they're different scales they probably won't line up very often, and we're getting quite a lot of nice additional variation in our material, which is pretty cool. Still further changes we can make. Obviously I've scaled the effects back down again, getting a little more complex now. Effectively what I've done here is create another tiling noise map. If I just preview this one, this might take a minute to compile, but it's probably okay. So same principle, taking another noise map, or in this case exact same noise map, and I've just done a very large scale. So taking the UV scale, scaled it right down. If I see here, we're going to really kind of break up the variation across our landscape. And I've just done some quick maths to it. So I've just done a quick contrast to give us a little bit more values. We don't really want grayscales, so a bit of contrast. 0.5 to sort of push up the blacks and the whites, and then I've multiplied by a value as well, and so anything that was slightly grey before, so now we're getting these big patches of white, big patches of black, and a little soft transition between them. And what I'm going to do, take the original texture, here our ground grass, and then I've got the same texture at a slightly different scale, so this one here divided by 256, this one here by 312. It's similar scale but slightly different. We're not trying to create a big variation here. And then I've also rotated it, so I've done what's called a swizzle. So here we've got a U and a V value. If we swap our U and our V values round, effectively what happens is our texture rotates 90 degrees. And you could always do this with a rotator. Swizzle is slightly cheaper, and you could rotate the UVs to some arbitrary value. But in this case we just want to rotate 90 degrees, going to create a little bit more variation that way. Obviously you don't want to animate in the rotation. So we've now got our texture this way, texture rotated 90 degrees, slightly different scale, and we're just going to blend between them using that sort of high contrast mask, and that's going to give us an error. What's going on? Plug the wrong thing in. There we go. If I just put that back, and we've done this to both the normal and the base colour. So obviously if we're going to rotate the diffuse colour, we have to rotate the normals as well. Same scale and same UV. Actually I've not done that, I've not swizzled this one. I've given a little bit of a visual error. Here we go. So now I've got a original base colour texture, and then a rotated slightly different scale base colour texture, and the exact same with the normals, and I'm lerping between them using that nice high contrast mask. And hopefully if we compile, give it a second. Is that compiling? Looks like it is. There it goes. And you can see here, especially if this sort of like zoomed out, there's areas where the tiling seems quite sort of pronounced, and then there's areas where it's kind of a little bit blurrier, and then areas where it's sort of been rotated and it's the other way around. And this is really going to help break up that tiling. And we're not using any extra textures here. We're already using that noise, so it just gives it that little bit extra variation as the sort of like the high contrast noise is spread over the over the landscape. Getting pretty close to the end now. We've done quite a lot to break things up. Different projections in noise space, world space of noises, and obviously just affecting different things. You may not need to do all of these, depending on what your material is and what sort of how pronounced your tiling is. But we're not adding too much extra complexity doing this. There's a few extra shader instructions, but we're not adding loads of new texture samples. It's just using the original kind of base color and noise, base color and normal, sorry, and then one noise texture, and we're just reusing that again at different scales again and again. So all this kind of tiling, if we look here at the front half of the screen, and I just swap back to the original, you can see quite how pronounced that difference is now. Here it's quite bad tiling, all the same textures repeating again and again. If I stick the rotated one on, we're getting a nice breaking up different things. And again, the original texture or the original material we're trying to do here, grass, it's going to be quite a noisy texture, and so the noise is going to help break up that. If we were using something like a sort of checkerboard floor, obviously we couldn't blend things with noises in the same way, because you'd have to make sure all the edges would line up, and there's a few different techniques you can do for that. But looking at the screen, we've got the front half quite nicely broken up, but here in the background, here in the distance, there's a lot of tiling still happening. We're getting this banding where you can see sort of lighter and darker bands. And so one thing, if I go back into here and just clear this material, if you ever actually looked at the default cube material, the default untextured material in Unreal, it has this trick in it where if you zoom in really close you get these checkers, but as you zoom out at some point they just fade away. So we can do that in our landscape, and we can have a different sort of material and just do a distance check to blend between them. It's a really sort of nice effects. You've almost certainly used it all the time, because you'll have seen it all the time at least, because there's as I say, it's here in the default material, and it's really simple to set up. So if I just stick on this, and I'll just sort of do a quick swap between the original, and you see here up in the background, well, let's just do 5. So there we've added these noise, but there's really quite a lot of banding still happening here in the distance. And if I just put that one on, and you can see now we've completely eliminated that noise in the background, and it's very simple. So we have here one of the material functions that comes from the engine, this camera depth fade, and if I just preview this, let's not recompile this, let's just make a new one. So just make a new material, camera depth fade. If I just copy that little network and then plug it into emissive. So originally this function is used for doing what it says, camera depth fade. So if you've got things like translucent particles, you don't really want your camera to clip through them. So what this will do will just fade those values out. Just see my encoder pausing for a bit while the there we go, while the material compile is happening. And I'm back, and so you can see here, as my camera is quite far away from this value, we're getting values of white. As I get close to this landscape, it goes black. And again, yeah, generally, or the reason sort of this original material function was set up was for translucent sprites. You put this into the opacity channel, and then as your camera gets close to them, they fade away, and then you don't get that clipping with the camera plane. But there's nothing stopping us using the same calculations to blend materials. So I've just set this to use the Vertex Shader. Vertex calculations are a lot cheaper than per pixel, and we're dealing with a large area here where we don't need that per pixel information. So so it's fine to use the sort of the Vertex Shader version of it. And these two values, fade offset and fade length, well, if I set the fade length down to 0, we'll get a completely hard line between black and white, and the fade offset, that just controls how far away the sort of transition to occur. So in this case, 512 units away from the camera, we're going to start fading, and then I had it down as what was it, 2048, so, and then 2000 units further away from that, it's going to be transitioning from black to white. And all I've done, if I go into my 06, where's my landscape material? that one. Stick this one back on. All we're doing, I've used my my original tiling grass with all those little bells and whistles, so I'm doing the base colour multiplication, I'm doing the normal flattening, I'm doing a blend between two slight variations in tiling and rotation, and I'm taking all of that and I'm just turning it into a material attributes. We covered this in previous videos, and I'm just doing a blend, and I'm using that distance mask, and the blend one, the distant material as it were, it's just the same as the original. It's just the original grass. There's no bells and whistles in this at all, but it's just set to a very high scale tiling. If I go in here, if I set this distance UV back to 256, there we are. We can see our banding. No good. You can see that error in the distance, and I can then change this 1024, say, and so we're getting quite a low res texture in the distance, but because it's in the distance, it doesn't matter. We can't see the pixelation if we just put this to 1024 everywhere. If I change this, it's not a parameter. Okay, well, if we made it 1024, I can probably do it this way, can't I? So if I change this to be something like, I don't know, minus 2000. There we are. So that's now our distance texture is now everywhere. I've just hacked the numbers quickly. You can see this is quite low res. This is no good for close-up front and camera effect. But if we put that back to 512, the stuff in the distance is low res, but very low res tiling. And because it's this same texture, because it's the same sort of noisy green grass, we don't actually see that transition at all. And because it's camera based, as is obviously if you move towards the distance doesn't get any closer because we get closer to the distance. And so if you were looking top down, obviously now there's going to be an issue. Here we can see that tiling again, but it's definitely a lot better than it was, and it's a very nice, smooth, seamless transition between those things because we're using such a large fade distance. So almost there. One last thing we can do, and this is almost sort of entirely optional really at this point. So the two things we added first, the base color projection and the normal map flattening, there's no reason we couldn't add them in the distance as well. So just sort of refactoring my material, so moving things around in the order that stuff gets done. I now have my sort of close-up grass. I might just comment these out. Close-up, where I've got the high contrast noise, and then that's blending between slightly different scaled and rotated. Ooh, missing my rotation. Make sure these are using the same UVs. In actual fact, probably a better way to do that would be that. There we go, not repeating nodes unnecessarily there. So now I have one set of tiling noise, one set of UVs into the same texture, another set of UVs into the same texture, and I'm just using that to create some variation in my grass, and then I'm blending that using my distance mask, and this is then the far grass or far texture, and then all the same data or the same logic that I had before. Projected, normal, and base color variation. So I'm creating two clouds noise, different scales, and this is now being applied over the whole material, near and far. And it's a very subtle difference, and it completely depends on what you're doing. But if you're using this to emulate kind of like the clouds and the sun coming through clouds, maybe you do want this everywhere, and you can see there a little subtle difference, or maybe you can, maybe you can't on the material, on the video, and that's it. Yeah, that's sort of all. Well, some of the techniques. There's almost certainly more, but if we just compare back to our original landscape grass, here we can see a really quite sort of visually obnoxious material tiling. As I said at the start, this is about the worst case you can possibly get. Big open grass field, but that's sometimes we make in games. Lots and lots of tiling, lots and lots of repetition of the same lights and darks, and then breaking that up with a little bit of noise in the base color, a little bit of noise in the normals. Maybe that's a bit overdone, but hard to tell on the video compression. And obviously we could add this to roughness. You could create some noise and do the roughness variation. Animation of those projections if we wish, and then rotating our UVs back and forth, giving us a little bit more variation, and then finally distance blends to break up the values in the distance as well. And so if we go here and just compare those two, no extra materials, no extra textures. If we do compare the material, so also the instruction counts, 131 instructions for the original grass, and then 179 for the sort of most complicated one. So definitely some extra cost happening, but well within the kind of like affordable ranges for most games at least. So yeah, there we are. How to break up tiling in large landscape materials. And as I say, obviously you can use these techniques on anything that's got large tiling materials on. So hope that was helpful and informative. As always, if you have any questions or comments, do let me know. I have a Patreon, so thanks to my Patreon backers for supporting the channel. Hopefully going to try and get more and more of these videos coming. So I have a few requests from Patreons for upcoming topics at the moment, so hopefully we'll get to them in the next few weeks. But as always, yeah, I will see you next time.